Hello, welcome back to Math Time with Professor Prime, and I am your host as always, Professor Prime. And today we have the Math and Final Fantasy VII 25th Anniversary Special. So, a while back, I made a Math and Final Fantasy VII video and a Math and Final Fantasy VII Remake video, and I've made other Final Fantasy videos since then, some being Final Fantasy VII videos. So what I'll do is I'm going to leave a link to the playlist for that in the description of this video, and I'm going to now tell you what this video will entail. So if you want to watch the other videos, yes, of course I encourage that. But I'm going to make this video so that you don't necessarily have to, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about Final Fantasy, and I'm going to talk about, yes, the game. Yes, the remake to that game. But also the compilation as a whole, and also like my experiences with Final Fantasy VII and its impact. And so it should be fun. And while I don't ever need an excuse to talk about Final Fantasy VII, I will take the excuse to do so. Because at the time of this recording, we just hit 25 years for Final Fantasy VII. It came out January 31st, 1997 in Japan. So yeah, that's pretty cool. 25 years. That is insane to me. And at that point, Final Fantasy was 10 years old at that time. And it is wild. It was known as the most expensive game to be made at that time, which is cool. It had like an $80 million marketing budget. It sold over 13.3 million copies. That was what I recently checked on. If it's more, I wouldn't be shocked. But that being said, I mention these things to just say, like, even when like talking about it and talking about how huge it is, you know, math is in the mix just right from the beginning. But yeah, so I'm actually going to start before going too deep into the math, talk about my experiences with the game and kind of letting things flow naturally. So that's the plan. That's the idea. So with Final Fantasy VII, it was not my first Final Fantasy game, but it was the first Final Fantasy game that I actually completed. So around 20 years ago, I got Final Fantasy VIII first. I got like a few hours into the game and I wasn't really feeling it. I would go back to play it, and I did enjoy playing it, and I got to replay it years later, and I enjoyed it even more. But this isn't about Final Fantasy VIII. But I bring it up because the reason why I was willing to give it another chance is I came across Final Fantasy VII in Blockbuster. And if you're not familiar with Blockbuster, ooh, that makes me feel old. But the idea is, like, you know, it was a video rental store, but they did get into video game rentals at the around that time, or maybe, you know, or maybe a bit before. But the idea is, like, yes, they rented out video games, and then they also, you know, sold them. So I actually purchased Final Fantasy VII from a Blockbuster store like around 20 years ago, and so I got that. You know, it looked and sounded cool. I knew some people who like had played it, and they made it sound cool. So yeah, I got it, got into it, and it was so awesome. I'm like, well, hey, look, if they're bringing it this hard in this game, maybe I can give Final Fantasy VIII another chance. And like I said, I did, and I enjoyed it. But back to Final Fantasy VII. So I enjoyed it for several reasons. One, the gameplay was fun to me, and I do want to definitely talk about math and the gameplay there. But that's not all. Like the music was always on point. Like you had Nobuo Uematsu. Like, if you're not familiar with that name, how? But seriously, if you're not familiar with that name, he has done a lot of Final Fantasy music and really like a lot of music for Square in general. He's an incredible composer. And we'll get to the music part of this too, but I very much enjoyed the gameplay, the music, and the story. It was a rich, deep story, and it hits you hard. Like the themes of life and death were such a big part of that game, and you know there's some real life like you know events that contributed to that, and I think that's interesting. But yeah, so I will try my best to avoid spoilers, But if you want to be absolutely safe and you haven't played Final Fantasy VII and you haven't played Final Fantasy VII Remake or really any of the Final Fantasy VII games or watched the movies or anything else involving Final Fantasy VII, I suggest avoiding this video because there may be spoilers ahead. Just be safe and assume that there are spoilers. If you are okay with that, continue. With that in mind, let's start with the game and go from there. So again, like I said some things about like how much it had for this marketing budget, like how much it sold, and all that. But that's not all, right? Like Final Fantasy VII, seven is the main. Sorry, seven, right? That number here indicates that it is the seventh main installment in the Final Fantasy series. And Final Fantasy is such a huge series at this point. It has a lot of spin-offs. It's kind of crazy. But with that in mind, the way the numbering works for Final Fantasy is a bit different than it works for other video games. Here, it just tells you that it's the seventh main installment. It doesn't necessarily mean that it is a sequel story-wise to other games. Instead, with Final Fantasy, when you get those main numbers, what they really are they are like sequels in a sense that they have similar themes, they have similar structure. Like I mean, because each game is doing something different with like the battle system. But the idea is like they have some intricate battle system. They have certain themes across the series. They have certain things that come with the idea of it being a main installment. Like so that number still conveys something, just not necessarily what you think. And it's worth noting that the naming convention in America was not great. Like they did some weird things, and so what they did is they had Final Fantasy, then they had Final Fantasy II and Final Fantasy III. When they released those in the U.S., they had those ports, but they weren't Final Fantasy one, two, and three. I mean, they were like one, but then sorry, one was one, two was four, if I'm not mistaken, and three was six. Which is confusing if you're, in America playing these games, because then you go from that and then you jump to seven, because seven, they kept the numbering. And it's interesting. And with the game and its development, it started in 1994. They paused it temporarily to work on Chrono Trigger, then went back to it in 95. Finished it in 1997, and came out with that. And the idea is originally they were planning to have Final Fantasy VII be on a night. Sorry, they were planning on Final Fantasy VII being on N64, but due to storage, issues in terms of size, among other issues, they changed their mind and went with Sony and had Final Fantasy VII released on the PlayStation. And it's just like it's interesting, and I think like they would have had to have like 30 discs to make things work for the N64. And if you're wondering, the idea of like N64, they still had cartridges, but there was like an add-on that like Nintendo was working on at the time, and Square had to consider that. Hopefully that sounded more cohesive than I feel like it sounded. But the idea was like space was the major issue, and they eventually came out with multiple discs on PlayStation. It's been a while, but I believe 3 discs, and that's interesting. It was a huge game, and it had a huge impact. And like I said, it went on to do have a massive like kind of self-franchise of its own within the Final Fantasy franchise, which is kind of crazy because you have the idea of the compilation of Final Fantasy VII. So yes, you have Final Fantasy VII, but you also have things like Advent Children. You have things like Dirge of Cerberus. You have Crisis Core. And I believe before Crisis, though that never made it over here to the States, Last Order was considered in that. But I believe that's not considered canon anymore. It's been a while since I've seen it, but it was an anime movie. So there's that. There was a book involved as well, and there's so many other things that get incorporated in the compilation of Final Fantasy. And I don't believe I just mentioned it, but the remake is part of that compilation as well. and we'll get to that. So I've talked a little bit about that, and I would like to say that before I get more into the math side of things, I am a big Final Fantasy fan, and I am a big Final Fantasy VII fan. It is in my top 10 for the games. Um, for my favorite games. It is in my top 10 for my favorite games of all time. It is huge, and I would routinely play it every 5 years for a while and see how I felt at that point in my life until the remake came out. Um, but it's been huge to continue to follow this series. I have a lot of good memories, playing it when I was younger. And I was playing it at a time where I got to start to explore, deeper stories in games. Like for me, the first game that really hit home with a deep story was Metal Gear Solid, which actually came out after Final Fantasy VII, but I played that first. Um, but yeah, so that's kind of set the tone for that year, and within a year's time, I played Final Fantasy VII, and it kind of changed things, and while I have played RPGs before, um, that was I think the biggest one, and it really set the tone. And later like I said, I finished Final Fantasy VIII, and I played Legend of Dragoon. And the Legend of Dragoon is a pretty awesome game. But this isn't about that. But it's just in that year, I played a lot of JRPGs. I had a lot of fun with them. And in Final Fantasy VII, just kind of it ups your expectations. And it's one of these games where some people will say that it's still somehow underrated, is deep as it is, and there's some other people who will say it's overrated for as deep as it is. And I get arguments on both sides of that. I feel it's properly rated, and I've gone back and forth with that over the years, but I feel it's pretty properly rated. It's big, one of the biggest games, period, but definitely one of the biggest RPGs, one of the biggest JRPGs, one of the biggest Final Fantasy games, if not the biggest. Although I guess 14 kind of overtook that, at least in terms of sales. Um, but the whole point is that it's huge, and it's not going anywhere. And they're still doing different things with it. You had First Soldier not long ago. That was a new addition to the series, and it's just there's a lot to consider. And yeah, so Final Fantasy VII, like I said, it was big. It had this big story, it had a complex battle system where it's you could learn it pretty easily, but mastering it was a different story. But if you put it in a time, you absolutely could do, just so many different things with that materia system. I'm telling you, if you know, you know. But we'll get into that too. But yeah, so I've just had a blast. Final Fantasy VII has been in my life for 20 years. I'm 35 now, and it's been in my life since I was 15. Oh, sorry, I will be 35. I'll be 35 in August of this year of 2022. So yeah, it's been about 20 years that it's been in my life, and that is utterly insane to me. And then when I think about the game in particular, to have everything come together like it did, it required a lot of math. And there's a lot of math at the forefront, but also a lot of math behind the scenes. Right? There's a lot of math in the gameplay. There's a lot of math in the story and how it's structured and how they're using the world and the characters to build that story. Right? Everything is calculated. There's a lot of math not only in the gameplay and the story, but there's math in the music, how it's structured, how that fits into gameplay, how that fits into cutscenes, how that makes you feel. Right? There's math in all of it. Right? There's math in the resource management as part of that gameplay. There's math in exploration. There's math for you as a player when you're interacting with these characters, when you are battling, when you're watching these cutscenes, and hearing that music, right? There's a lot of math in processing that and experiencing that. There's a lot of math that goes into the amount of time that you're spending on the game and how you are doing your resource management and how you're doing the material system or how you're using the material system. So with that in mind, let's talk about the gameplay a little bit, right? So with the gameplay, the idea is you're exploring these worlds, you're uncovering bits of the story, and you're battling opponents, right? The idea is you dish out damage till they die, while you try to not die. And to that effect, right, it sounds simple, but then it gets pretty complex. And I think like in a way that feels good, in a way that's very calculated. So there's this idea that you have things like HP, you have things like magic, you have things like your strength and your speed and your luck and your evasion and all that good stuff. Um, and all of that and all of the other stats are expressed numerically, right? So you have an idea of what you can do, like how much damage you can dish out, how much damage you can take. And so as you go on through the game, right, you are building up your levels. You're building these up by going on your missions, fighting your opponents, and building up experience points. And as you level up, your stats are naturally increasing. And so there's math in all of this, right? And then right, you're getting better weapons. You're getting better items, and all that changes how you approach the game, and you have some versatility in it, right? And there's math in those increases that you get with different items and different weapons. And the thing is, with those weapons, with those items, or also equipment, there are different things to consider, right? So when it comes to the weapons and it comes to the equipment, they have different slots, right? You might have one slot, or you might have two, you might have three, you might have going all the way up to seven, and you might have some of these joined, so you can combine different materia to have different effects. And the idea is, like, in general, with these slots, you're filling them with different materia. Some of these materia, they increase your health or increase your MP. They might increase your luck. They might do cool things like give you 2x cut, and which with these different materia, they can be leveled up. They can get AP, they can get ability points, and they can level up, like I said. And if you master them, sometimes different things can happen. Like if you master 2x cut, right? You get level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4 master, if I'm not mistaken. And when you master it, you get 4x cut, and you get a little baby 2x cut. And you can play that game, so you can have all your characters have like eventually 4x cut if you're doing that right, which allows you to consecutively do 4 attacks. And if your characters are like, yoked out, there's a better word than that. But if they're like completely leveled up, right, like they're doing maximum damage with those strikes, right, and it's insane. And the idea is you could do stuff like that. You could also like do different magic, and and magic also levels up. You could do things like counter. Which is cool. You do preemptive strike, which allows you to strike first, regardless of what your speed is. There are different strategies, right? You can do different elemental damage, and that can also be done to you. There's different status effects, and there's math and all of that, and how it functions and flows, and how it all works together, and how your characters are progressing throughout the game. And you can also level grind, and that's the thing. And as you're going on, there are the ideas like bosses are going to be tougher, right? They can dish out more damage. They can take less damage, and you have to adjust accordingly. They may have special abilities, and you might have different points in the game where certain characters demonstrate certain things in a cutscene or when they're in your party, and that gives you a good idea of that character. And what they could really do. And I think that's all really cool. And you throw in the music and how that makes you feel, right? It can amp you up. And it's all strategic because it's sort of like a loop. It's going throughout the battle. And it's all strategic, like how it begins, how it goes, and how it ends, and how that keeps on going in a cycle while you battle. There's so many things that you could do. And ideas like you have this active time battle system where, you are, looking at sorry, you have a gauge, and that gauge fills, and then you can attack when that happens, and that can increase or decrease depending on your status, depending on your character, what level they're at, what items they're equipping. Like they can have faster ATP build up, they can have slower. It depends. But the whole thing is like, right, so you have all this stuff, and it's just very interesting. And like with the materia, not only do they give you different abilities, but they can affect your health, they can affect your MP, they can do so many different things. And I'm trying to make sure I remember everything correct, but the idea is like materia does a lot. It's doing a lot of heavy lifting in that game. And having the material system as it is and being so crucial to so many different stats in the game and different abilities, you could really get in there and you can customize things to play how you want to play. And it can be a beautiful thing. And then not only do you have like bosses and some uncommon enemies, but you have like the idea of super bosses, which are not uncommon in, RPGs. You have things like the Emerald Weapon, who has like 1 million HP. You have things like the Ruby Weapon, which I forget the HP for that, but there's only certain skills that you could use on it. And the idea is still like, not die while you kill it. And then you have things like the Ultimate Weapon, where, it has less HP than like the other super bosses. And you encounter that in the story, you could chase it down. And I feel like it's less out of the way than the other ones. But when you come across that and you beat it, you get like Cloud's Ultimate Weapon. And that allows him to do more damage, like notably the higher your HP is. And so I bring up all these things though, it's because like math is just like everywhere in that game, and there's a lot of math behind the scenes. There's math in the marketing, which I mentioned, like that has a certain budget. The game itself has a certain budget when you're going to do that. It was the first Final Fantasy game that went from 2D to 3D, and like I mentioned before, like one of the reasons why they ended up going with the PlayStation is because it was more appealing, right? You could store more on a CD, and so they had to plan accordingly and see how many CDs that they needed, right? They had to see what they wanted to do in terms of the characters and the models and the worlds. They had to build those up. They had to program, and there's math in all of that and how it all functions. And back then, you didn't have a lot of huge programmer teams like you did now. You might have like 20 or so people on a reasonably sized game. Final Fantasy VII had over 100. And that should tell you something. It was a huge game back then. And despite things changing in the video game world, it is still huge. It is one of the most recognizable games, period. And its characters have appeared in so many other games. And, there's money in how that all works and math in that money. And I mentioned, there's a lot in the compilation of Final Fantasy VII, and with the remake, I don't want to like spoil anything, but it went in some different directions, and I think that's pretty cool. And all of that was like a calculated decision, and the gameplay was like quite different. It was real time, right? But I guess it's better to say like a real time kind of turn-based hybrid, but it's interesting. There's a lot of math and how that all functions, and you still get materia in that game, so it builds off of what was already there. And the scale in terms of like what it took to make that so far took a lot of math. And we got the remake part 1. We know there's at least going to be a part 2, but we don't know how many parts they're going to be. I mean, there's math in their decisions to make that and when they get that information across. And it's just like, it's all very interesting to me. And then you get like other games like in the series where like they did Dirge of Cerberus that mixed things up. You got like a shooter, pretty much like a third-person shooter that like definitely ripped off some Devil May Cry elements. I'm just saying. And I'm not the biggest fan of that game, but I played it. It was all right. Then you have things like Crisis Core, which was on the PSP, which I wish that was on a bigger system because I never did get a PSP. I've played a PSP, played several games on it, but like I didn't own one, so it's like I didn't get that. So maybe someday, but like I've seen some cutscenes which are beautiful, and I am familiar with the story. And it's just like, it sounds pretty interesting, and they did some cool stuff there too, gameplay wise. And then you have like Advent Children, and that's pretty cool. So like they had to figure out how long they wanted to make this movie, what kind of story they wanted to tell, and there's like a lot of math in that. There's a lot of math in the animation, a lot of math in figuring out how the fight choreography would go for each scene, math in the voice acting, math in taking that voice acting and like dubbing it in different languages. There's math in the budget they had for that, math in how they wanted the lighting, math in the camera work and angles. And you could say the same for like the game too, and different games in the series. It's just like it was CG, and there's a lot of math in how that all works and functions. So it's just like there's a lot of math in Final Fantasy VII. There's a lot of math in Final Fantasy. There's a lot of math in gaming. There's a lot of math everywhere. And I hope, if nothing else, you see that in this video. And so, back to when it came out, right? January 31st, 1997. So we have this date, something that is mathematical in nature, and it gives you an idea of what might have been going on, right? Like context is key, but if you were around during that time, you definitely have somewhat of an idea what was going on. If you were like gaming and you were seeing things, or at the very least, like years down the line, you might have had a better idea of how things were going on. And now we're like 25 years away from when it came out. And that should tell you something too, right? Like, so 25, when we're talking about years, it's a reasonable amount of time for us in our lifespan, and a lot can happen in 25 years. And so you're seeing it be around for 25 years, still be really popular, still have multiple entries in it with more in the horizon, and that's telling. And having the context that you have from being around and playing the game and seeing how it has evolved, I think that is an amazing and beautiful thing. And again, like characters from those games have showed up in other franchises, and that's interesting to me. And I'm keeping an eye on this video because it's getting quite long, over 25 minutes now, which wasn't intentional, but kind of works out nicely in a weird way. But with that in mind, Final Fantasy VII was huge. Final Fantasy VII is huge, and I would be willing to bet that it is still going to be quite huge in the future. It was a benchmark in gaming, and it was definitely a pivotal game for me growing up. Because I know, to share, get a little deep for a second, which is always uncomfortable, but I think needed to have reasonable insightful conversations sometimes. So around the time that I played it, I was experiencing my first go with nihilism, something that has never really left my life. I was questioning everything, the purpose of everything. I was questioning life, questioning death, dealing with those themes. And so seeing life and death be such an important part of a game was amazing. And I think with something like that, it is really cool because not only do you have video games being a beautiful form of art, but it's a beautiful form of art that allows you to interact with the world and the characters. It's a beautiful piece of art that allows you a unique opportunity for empathy, to work out some themes as well. And so I feel like it was good to play that game, and much like Metal Gear Solid, it came across in my life at the right time. And it is the Final Fantasy game that made me a fan of the series. It made me give other Final Fantasy games a chance, and I keep on coming back to it because of how pivotal it has been. And I am not a fan of every single thing that is Final Fantasy VII. No, because I have my own taste, but I enjoy Final Fantasy VII as a whole. I enjoy the stories that they're trying to tell. And I look forward to the future of Final Fantasy VII, and I look forward to the math in it. That being said, I hope you have an excellent day. If you haven't tried Final Fantasy VII, I hope you do someday. And if you have, awesome. Either way, have an excellent day. I'll see you in the next one. Professor Prime out.